In Los Angeles and other major cities across the United States, mass incarceration is one of the most complex and impactful issues affecting its citizens of color. Mass incarceration in Los Angeles is the product of centuries of settler colonialism, institutionalized racism, and dodgy policy. Hopefully, I can help explain the historical context of what's going on and how mass incarceration is used as a tool to control the social and political advancement of LA's most marginalized residents. Our story begins with the Tongva Native Americans who settled the Los Angeles basin in around 500 AD and lived there peacefully, trading with nearby tribes and supporting small villages in the area. Beginning in the 16th century and truly accelerating into the 18th century, Spanish colonists invaded and colonized Tongva territory. The Spanish believed that they were culturally more advanced than the Tongva people and made it their duty to civilize the savages by converting them to Christianity and showing them the proper Spanish way to live. They settled a town, one with a really long name, but that was eventually shortened to Los Angeles. One of the first buildings the colonists built was a jail. After the Mexican people gained their independence from Spain in 1821, land was redistributed away from the Catholic Church and into the hands of Mexican citizens. Well, except for the natives. While Mexican Californians, were given tens of thousands of acres for their ranchos, the majority of Gabrielino Tongva Native Americans, were given nothing in the post-revolution period. Californians regularly used Gabrielino slave labor to facilitate all aspects of the Los Angeles economy, but they were getting tired of the few Gabrielinos who didn't work but still lived in their city. They began arresting unemployed Gabrielinos on vagrancy charges. But then the Americans came. By 1846, the United States had declared war on Mexico. By 1848, Los Angeles was an American town. And by 1850, Los Angeles was an American town in the federally recognized state of California. So how did Americans decide to celebrate their arrival into the Los Angeles basin? If you guessed by committing a genocide against the Native Americans, you're right. For starters, the local and state governments ramped up the vagrancy laws, requiring only a credible witness to justify throwing natives in jail for petty crimes like gambling or public drunkenness. Along with needlessly arresting the natives, the American government also lied and cheated them too. From 1851 to 1853, the U.S. government signed 18 treaties with 134 tribal leaders in California, ceding most of California's land to the government, but granting those tribes small but permanent reserves to continue their way of life. Those treaties were never ratified by Congress. You see, white people wanted to live in California, and they definitely didn't want uncultured brown people there either. So Congress did the sensible thing and hid the treaties, essentially hoping that if no one knew about the treaties, then they didn't actually exist. And go figure, no one with power ended up caring. So, just to recap, the Tongva Native Americans, native to the city of LA, were colonized by the Spanish, then the Americans, who wished to either see them civilized or used as cheap labor. Those who refused were routinely jailed and enslaved, and those who cooperated were offered few choices in life outside of menial labor and servitude to their colonial masters. By the end of the 1870s, there were 316 Native Americans recorded in the city, an estimated 97% drop from the estimated 5,000 to 10,000 Tongva living in the area before Spanish invasion. Even the Mexican rancheros that lived off the land around LA were destroyed by drought and debt, leaving white Americans as the population majority and the dominating force in Los Angeles, in another successful exercise of manifest destiny. One of the major tools used to control and destroy the Tongva population used by the Americans was convict labor. Jails in Los Angeles were always full of Indians because of these insane vagrancy laws that I talked about earlier, so the city decided to put them to good use by making them build downtown LA as we know it. But wait, you ask, isn't that slavery? Well, yes, but actually no. Convict labor was the new hot system that swept across the United States after a tall dude with a weird hat decided to end racism forever by freeing all the black people in 1863. How did the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War lead to convict labor? Well, there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment. See, the 13th Amendment reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Yes, this amendment ended formal slavery. However, people soon realized that you could easily create slaves by arresting people on petty crimes and forcing them to work long, unpaid hours on the chain gang. And so they did. They did this across the United States, notably in the Deep South, where petty crimes were used to re-enslave freed African Americans, contributing to the post-Civil War Jim Crow South. In Los Angeles, chain gangs of Native Americans, well, until there weren't any left, and later transient laborers that stayed in LA in the winter, called tramps, helped build the historic roads and parks we can see in LA today. These tramps are also responsible for the expansion of the LA County jail system. Since so many people were arrested within a similar time period, the sheriff's office was forced to either arrest less tramps or find a bigger place to put them all in. The city chose the second option. By the end of the tramp crisis, the city's jail capacity had increased by a factor of 10, mainly used on tramps to supply the city with large amounts of convict labor, until World War I greatly reduced the amount of unemployed seasonal workers occupying the benches, bars, and parks of LA. Let's talk about illegal immigration. Illegal immigration is a hot topic in today's world, but the framework for all the policy issues we're having now actually comes from mid to late 1800s California. Starting in the middle of the 19th century, economic downturn in mainland China led to mass immigration from China to the western United States, where they slid in the place of the murdered natives to do the jobs that nobody else wanted to do. For example, the Central Pacific Railroad was built almost entirely from Chinese immigrant labor. When the railroads were finished, Chinese immigrants began settling in major port cities across the western seaboard, and Chinatown sprung up in large cities. Anti-Chinese sentiment rose across California and white elites, resulting in the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and later the Geary Act in 1892, both effectively banning the entry of Chinese laborers into the country. Chinese immigrants rightfully decided that these laws were garbage, so they decided to test the constitutionality of them. Two major landmark cases came directly from the implementation of the Geary Act, the first being Fong Yue-ting versus United States. In accordance with the Geary Act, illegal immigrants that were found were immediately arrested and deported without due process. The Supreme Court ruled that since a deportation was an administrative process and not a punishment for a crime, that the capture, holding, and eventual deportation process of illegal immigrants was not part of the criminal justice system. The other major case was Wong Wing versus United States. Wong Wing versus United States determined that living as an illegal immigrant in the U.S. was not a crime. Since deportation was an administrative process and not a punishment for a crime, detained illegal immigrants could not legally be held in prison or any punitive building belonging to the criminal justice system. These two cases essentially set the precedent for all the immigration law we have today. The precedent set by these cases is the reason why men, women, and children alike can be detained against their will in jails, called immigration detention centers to avoid defying the Supreme Court, while awaiting the extradition process. These cases are also the reason why, for the most part, illegal immigrants can live freely in the United States, because as long as they can avoid police interaction, it is not a crime to be an illegal immigrant in this country. By the beginning of the 20th century, improved irrigation techniques would allow California to grow into an agricultural haven, and naturally, the white landowners needed someone to work the land to cultivate the crops and make them rich. The Immigration Act of 1917 formally banned any and all Asian immigrants coming from the Asiatic Exclusion Zone, so the task of working the farmland fell on Mexican immigrants. The story of Mexican immigrants follows the story of every other minority group I've covered so far, sadly. By 1924, groups comprised of mostly young, poor white men across America's southern border calling themselves the Border Patrol began raiding farms for illegal Mexican immigrants and taking them back to Mexico. Today, the Border Patrol is a governmental entity that employs over 16,000 federal agents on our southern border, and Mexican immigrants are the prime target of all that manpower. African Americans in LA. As a result of the Great Migration in the 1910s, African Americans began settling in LA at a high rate. As usual, the white people in charge of the city were none too pleased. LA was being advertised as the Aryan City in the Sun, the perfect place to raise a white American family. Because of this, African Americans were locked into settling neighborhoods like South Central LA and Watts. At first, South Central and Watts were seen as powerful black neighborhoods, where the majority of people achieved a middle-class lifestyle and the nightlife was second to none. However, police corruption and brutality, along with decreased rates of homeownership among black families, turned the neighborhoods into places unfit for land development for the rich white business owners. Police brutality was common, and often deadly as citizens turned to police to crack down on vice in their neighborhoods, without knowing that often those same police officers were on vice lords' payrolls. This culminated in the Watts Rebellion, when tensions with police boiled over, resulting in a 6-day uprising, where police and the National Guard killed 34 people as they tried to suppress the violence. This is not the end of the story of over-policing in predominantly black neighborhoods in LA. Both the war on drugs and the war on gangs flooded these neighborhoods with police. The so-called war on drugs severely criminalized minor drug offenses, resulting in overfilled LA jails with predominantly black and brown populations booked for drug charges. This rise in prison population led to the construction of more prisons in California as a whole, with 23 new prisons being built after 1984. The war on gangs in the 1980s and onward targeted people of color living in these rough neighborhoods as gang members. This led to an increasingly fearful and racist police presence that disproportionately monitored neighborhoods of color because of things like Operation Hammer, the first gang database ever created in LA. So what does all this mean in context of today? The idea of settler colonialism is one of the driving forces in the background of the story of mass incarceration in Los Angeles. Beginning with the Tongva Indians in the 17th century, the Spanish attempted to convert the heathens to their superior culture by showing them how to farm, speak Spanish, and worship God. While the Spanish thought they were doing the natives a service, they simply destroyed the Tongva way of life, replacing those who resisted or died with more culturally Spanish people. The Spanish gave way to the Mexicans, and the Mexicans gave way to the American settler, whose goal at the end of the day was to create a homogeneous, white frontier where white American values could flourish. To their credit, they succeeded, but every time a minority group attempts to spread their culture into the American settler society, they are struck down with fury. The Chinese, the Mexicans, and later the African Americans all fell prey to the system that held them down as second-class citizens because of the unfortunate fact that they weren't white. Because of settler colonialism driving the policies I went over, it should be to no one's surprise that today's society is just a continuation of what occurred on the frontier hundreds of years ago. Illegal immigration and the Border Patrol are still massive issues in today's society, culminating in Trump's build the wall rhetoric, because there are too many brown people in the country. Black neighborhoods are still massively over-policed, and the effects of the war on drugs and gangs can be seen throughout LA as well as the state of California. 54% of LA's city budget goes to the LAPD, and nearly $60 million are spent every year on policing the predominantly black neighborhoods of East and West South Central LA. Teenagers are arrested for graffiti mural art and given 2 years in prison for violating parole for visiting family who are simply registered as gang members. Women are forced to go to unsanitary and inhumane prisons. Mental health services for the incarcerated are woefully lacking. All the money, time, and effort used to update LA's prison system to the largest in the world yielded no results outside of kicking its most marginalized citizens further into poverty. California used to be number one in education. Since the massive rise in police spending, California now hovers somewhere between 41st to 47th in the nation in public education. Los Angeles leads the world in both arrests and deportations, and is a key cog in the overcrowding of American prisons, already the largest prison system in the world. Some are trying to change this through policy and community organization. The $1 Million Hoods Research Group, the Youth Justice Coalition, the ACLU, and many more are fighting to tear down the oppressive system of mass incarceration and explore options that will give LA's citizens of color a fighting chance in the future. Their progress has been slight, but gradual, and we can only hope that in this era of unlimited information, people realize the mistake of mass incarceration and its consequences and work together to stop it.